He didn't vanish suddenly. He didn't stop answering calls. He didn't leave a goodbye message. He didn't disappear into the night unnoticed. In fact, for hours before he vanished, Bryce Laspisa was doing the one thing missing people are never supposed to do. He was talking. He spoke calmly with his parents. He reassured police officers. He passed welfare checks. He insisted again and again that he was fine. And then, in the early hours of a quiet California morning, Bryce drove his car off a cliff. Not by accident, not while fleeing, not while being chased. He survived the crash. That should have been the end of the story. Instead, it was the beginning. Bryce climbed out of the wreckage, left behind his phone, his wallet, his identity, and walked away into the darkness. No footprints, no trail, no witnesses. Search teams arrived within hours. Dogs searched the terrain. Helicopters scanned the hills. Investigators followed every possible path. They found nothing, not a single confirmed sign that Bryce Laspisa existed beyond that moment. And that's what makes this case different, because Bryce didn't disappear due to chaos. He disappeared despite communication, despite intervention, despite people actively watching him in real time. This is not a story about a man who was unreachable. It's a story about a man who was reachable, right up until the moment he wasn't. What happened during those hours of waiting? Why did he drive off the road? Why did he walk away instead of calling for help? And most disturbing of all, how does someone survive a crash, walk into open terrain, and leave nothing behind? Tonight, we're breaking down every verified moment of Bryce Laspisa's final day. From the phone calls that should have saved him, to the crash that should have stopped him, to the unanswered questions that remain more than a decade later. Because somewhere between calm conversations and complete silence, Bryce Laspisa vanished, and no one knows why. Welcome to Unseen Events. If you follow real unsolved cases and deep investigations, subscribe now and stay with us till the truth ends. Before his name became associated with one of the most confusing and unsettling disappearances in modern true crime, Bryce Laspisa was a 19-year-old college student living a life that, on the surface, appeared ordinary and stable. Bryce was born and raised in Illinois, in a structured middle-class household. His parents, Mike and Karen Laspisa, were present, attentive, and deeply involved in his upbringing. This was not a family marked by distance or dysfunction. Communication was regular, expectations were clear. When problems arose, they were discussed, not ignored. Bryce was known for being thoughtful and intelligent. He wasn't loud or impulsive. Friends described him as quiet, analytical, and introspective, someone who observed more than he spoke. He wasn't socially isolated, but he wasn't reckless either. He formed close friendships selectively and valued routine. That personality profile matters. Because Bryce was not someone who disappeared emotionally before he disappeared physically. In 2013, Bryce was attending Sierra College in Rocklin, California. He had recently moved away from home and was living off campus, a transition that brought independence along with pressure, new responsibilities, new expectations, new social environments. This was not unusual for someone his age. College transitions often involve stress, academic demands, financial considerations, and identity shifts. Bryce's parents were aware of these pressures and remained in close contact with him. They spoke frequently by phone. Bryce answered calls. He responded to texts. There was no period where he went silent or withdrew from communication. In fact, what stands out most about Bryce's behavior in the weeks before his disappearance is not secrecy, but consistency. He stayed connected. Friends later noted subtle changes. Bryce appeared more reflective, sometimes quieter than usual. But those observations were not accompanied by alarm. He did not express fear. He did not indicate that he was in trouble. He did not ask for help, nor did he suggest that he wanted to disappear or start over. There were no known threats in his life, no restraining orders, no legal issues. No financial collapse. He was not running from anything obvious. However, there were contradictions. In the days leading up to his disappearance, Bryce's behavior began to diverge from his explanations. He told people he was fine, yet his actions suggested hesitation, delay, and internal conflict. Even then, he continued to communicate with his parents calmly and clearly. This is where the case becomes uniquely troubling. In many missing person cases, investigators can identify warning signs: emotional withdrawal, secretive behavior, dramatic life changes, or a clear desire to cut ties. Bryce exhibited none of these patterns in a conventional sense. He did not pack belongings. He did not drain bank accounts. He did not say goodbye. He maintained contact until the very end. Bryce's parents later emphasized that their son was not impulsive. He was not known for dramatic gestures. If Bryce said he was okay, they had no reason to doubt him, because historically, his words matched his actions. And yet something was shifting beneath the surface. Bryce had recently experienced changes that, while not extreme, may have carried emotional weight. A new academic environment, new living arrangements, the subtle isolation that can come from being far from home for the first time. None of these factors alone explain disappearance, but together they form a context. What makes Bryce's case particularly difficult to interpret is the absence of escalation. There was no single argument, no traumatic event, no documented breakdown. Instead, there was delay, hours spent in places without moving, decisions that appeared intentional but unexplained, reassurances that conflicted with behavior. Throughout all of this, Bryce continued to speak with his parents. He did not sound panicked. He did not sound disoriented. His language remained coherent, controlled, and deliberate. That consistency challenges many assumptions, because Bryce did not vanish in a moment of chaos. He vanished after prolonged contact, after repeated opportunities to change course, after conversations where help was offered. Understanding who Bryce was before his disappearance is essential, not to assign blame or create theories, but to strip away misconceptions. He was not reckless. He was not disconnected. He was not invisible. He was a young man navigating transition, maintaining family ties, and outwardly insisting that everything was under control. Which is why what happened next feels so profoundly unsettling, because when Bryce Laspisa disappeared, he didn't do so suddenly. He did so slowly, and he did it while people were watching, without realizing they were witnessing the beginning of an ending. On the surface, the plan was simple. In late August 2013, Bryce Laspisa told his parents he was driving home to Illinois from California. It was a long trip, over 2,000 miles, but not unusual. Bryce had made the drive before. His parents expected periodic check-ins, nothing more. What they didn't expect was that the trip would stretch into a series of inexplicable stops, reversals, and hours of movement that led nowhere. Bryce left Rocklin, California on August 27th. He packed his car, said goodbye to friends, and began driving east. From the beginning, however, the timeline didn't align with normal travel behavior. He didn't make steady progress. Instead of covering hundreds of miles, Bryce lingered. At various points, he stopped for long periods without explanation. He told his parents he was tired, then that he was resting, then that he would leave soon. Each time, the reassurance sounded reasonable, but the pattern wasn't. Hours passed, then more hours, yet Bryce remained in roughly the same area. His parents grew concerned but not alarmed. Bryce was calm. His voice didn't waver. He wasn't slurring words. He wasn't panicked. He simply insisted that everything was under control. At one point, Bryce stopped at a rest area near Buttonwillow, California, still far from where he should have been if he were actively traveling. Surveillance footage later confirmed that he remained there for several hours. This is where the trip begins to feel unnatural. Most people, especially on a long-distance drive, push forward after rest. Bryce did not. He delayed repeatedly, yet never articulated why. When his parents asked directly if something was wrong, he denied it. Then came the first reversal. After spending hours stopped, Bryce told his parents he was turning around. He wasn't going home anymore. Instead, he said he was heading back towards Southern California. There was no clear reason given, no emergency, no destination, no explanation that matched the effort of changing direction after such a long drive. Still, Bryce sounded composed. He didn't argue. He didn't lash out. He calmly stated his decision as if it were logical, even though it wasn't. Concern escalated. His parents urged him to stop driving if he was tired. They asked him to pull over. They suggested rest, food, sleep. Bryce agreed to all of it, verbally. But again, his actions didn't match his words. At one point, Bryce ran out of gas near Castaic Lake, north of Los Angeles. This detail is critical, not because it's dramatic, but because it suggests disorganization inconsistent with his personality. Bryce was not careless with logistics, yet now he was stranded. A highway patrol officer responded. The officer spoke with Bryce directly and reported no obvious signs of distress. Bryce appeared alert. He declined assistance beyond refueling. He told the officer he was fine. His parents, increasingly uneasy, asked the officer to check on him again. A second officer arrived. Again, Bryce was evaluated. Again, no immediate danger was identified. This repeated confirmation by professionals that Bryce appeared okay has haunted the case ever since. Because despite multiple points of intervention, nothing stopped what followed. After refueling, Bryce drove away. Instead of heading toward a clear destination, he took an isolated route near Castaic Lake, an area marked by rugged terrain, steep drop-offs, and minimal traffic, especially at night. Then the movement stopped. Bryce's car was later found abandoned at the bottom of an embankment. The vehicle had been deliberately driven off the road. The damage suggested acceleration, not an accident. Inside the car, investigators found Bryce's personal belongings, his phone, his wallet, his laptop. Nothing indicated a struggle. Nothing suggested robbery. Nothing suggested urgency. What makes the road trip not make sense is not just where Bryce went, but how many chances there were for it to end differently. He spoke to his parents repeatedly. He interacted with law enforcement. He stopped multiple times. At no point did he say goodbye. At no point did he express fear. At no point did he indicate he intended to disappear. And yet, step by step, Bryce moved toward isolation. The road trip wasn't chaotic. It was deliberate, but inexplicable. Investigators have long debated whether Bryce was experiencing emotional distress, internal conflict, or something he couldn't articulate. But no theory fully explains why he would abandon a plan, reverse direction, exhaust his resources, and place himself in danger without once asking for help, especially when help was available. The road trip wasn't a straight line toward disappearance. It was a slow drift away from normal decision-making. And by the time anyone realized how serious it was, Bryce Laspisa was already somewhere no one could reach him. If Bryce Laspisa's road trip raised questions, what happened next deepened the mystery. Because for hours at a time, Bryce Laspisa did something that defies normal logic. He waited. Not briefly, not out of necessity, but for long, uninterrupted stretches, doing nothing that anyone could later explain. After leaving Rocklin, Bryce did not move with urgency. Surveillance footage and cell phone records later revealed that he spent extended periods parked in rest areas and roadside locations, sometimes for several hours at a time. He wasn't sleeping through the night. He wasn't stuck in traffic. He wasn't waiting for someone. He was simply stationary. At one rest stop near Buttonwillow, California, Bryce remained parked for nearly 7 hours. During this time, he made phone calls. He texted. He told his parents he was fine. He said he was resting and would be back on the road shortly. But he didn't leave. For his parents, this behavior was unsettling but not yet alarming. People get tired. Long drives take a toll. Bryce's calm tone reassured them, at least initially. But as the hours passed, concern replaced patience. Why wasn't he moving? When asked directly what he was waiting for, Bryce never gave a clear answer. He didn't say he was meeting someone. He didn't say he needed repairs. He didn't say he was sick or afraid. He simply said he was okay. That response repeated itself throughout the night and into the next day. I'm fine. I'll leave soon. Don't worry. Yet nothing changed. This is one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Bryce was not unreachable. He was not hiding. He was actively communicating while remaining inexplicably still. Most disappearances involve a sudden break. Phones go silent, contact stops, a clear moment of loss occurs. Bryce's disappearance unfolded in slow motion. His parents monitored his progress, or lack of it, through calls and updates. They knew where he was. They knew he was awake. They knew he was capable of conversation. But they didn't know what was happening inside his mind. At one point, Bryce told his parents he was turning around and heading back towards Southern California. This decision made no sense given the context, but again, he did not sound confused or distressed. He sounded resolved. That made the waiting more confusing. Why announce movement and then delay again? Why reverse course without explanation? Why remain parked for hours after declaring intention? These are not the actions of someone panicking. They are also not the actions of someone making practical decisions. It is as if Bryce was stuck between two impulses, unable to move forward, unable to fully stop, and unwilling or unable to explain why. During one of these prolonged stops, Bryce's parents became sufficiently concerned that they contacted law enforcement to perform a welfare check. This decision would later haunt them, not because it was wrong, but because of what followed. When officers approached Bryce, they found a young man who appeared alert and coherent. He answered questions appropriately. He denied needing help. He did not appear intoxicated or disoriented. The officers saw no immediate cause to detain him. And so, Bryce was allowed to leave. This moment is critical. It confirms that Bryce's behavior, while unusual, did not outwardly signal crisis. To professionals trained to identify danger, he did not appear to be in immediate distress, yet his pattern of waiting continued. After refueling near Castaic Lake, Bryce again stopped moving. He remained parked for hours in an area that offered no shelter, no services, and no reason to stay. His parents pleaded with him to rest properly, to get a hotel, to let them help. Bryce acknowledged their concern, but declined their suggestions. He said he just needed time. Time for what, he never said. In hindsight, the waiting feels intentional, not indecisive, but suspended, as if Bryce was delaying something he knew was coming. Investigators and psychologists have since debated what those hours represent. Some suggest internal conflict, a young man grappling with pressure, identity, or emotional strain he could not articulate. Others point to possible mental health struggles that had not yet been diagnosed. But none of these explanations fully account for the behavior. Because Bryce did not withdraw, he engaged. He reassured. He remained connected. And yet, he did not move. That contradiction, connection without progress, is what makes this phase of the case so unsettling. The hours of waiting were not passive. They were active choices to remain in place while the world around him continued moving. Each hour increased the distance between Bryce and help. Each delay narrowed the margin for intervention. Each "I'm fine" postponed urgency. By the time Bryce finally drove away from Castaic Lake, the pattern of waiting had already shaped the outcome. He had lingered long enough for night to fall, long enough for concern to turn into dread, long enough for isolation to become unavoidable. The waiting wasn't meaningless. It was the calm before disappearance. And when Bryce finally moved again, it was not towards safety. It was towards something no one was prepared to stop. What makes the disappearance of Bryce Laspisa so difficult to understand is not the silence that followed, but the communication that came before it. For nearly an entire day, Bryce remained in contact with his parents. Not sporadically, not briefly, but consistently. Phone records show multiple calls between Bryce and his parents, Mike and Karen Laspisa, during the final hours before he vanished. These were not rushed conversations. They were not fragmented. They were calm, coherent, and at times reassuring. This is the opposite of what most families experience before a disappearance. Bryce did not stop answering his phone. He did not send cryptic messages. He did not avoid questions. He talked. When his parents first realized that Bryce wasn't making progress on his drive, they called to check in. Bryce answered. His voice was steady. He explained that he was tired and resting. He said he would continue soon. There was no panic in his tone. As the hours passed and Bryce still hadn't moved, his parents called again. This time, their concern was more direct. They asked why he was still stopped. They asked if something was wrong. Bryce told them no. He insisted he was fine. That phrase, "I'm fine," would repeat itself throughout the night. At no point did Bryce tell his parents he was scared. At no point did he say he was in danger. At no point did he ask them to come get him. Instead, he responded patiently to their concern, as if he understood it but didn't share it. This created a terrible paradox for his parents. They could hear his voice. They could judge his emotional state. They could ask questions and receive answers, but they could not see what he was doing. As Bryce's delays grew longer, his parents began to sense that something was wrong, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't explain. Why was he stopping for so long? Why was he changing direction? Why did his actions contradict his reassurances? Eventually, their concern reached a breaking point. Fearing that Bryce might be exhausted or impaired, his parents contacted law enforcement and asked for a welfare check. This decision is often misunderstood, but at the time it was a rational response. They were not accusing their son of wrongdoing. They were trying to protect him. When officers approached Bryce, they spoke with him directly. They assessed his condition, and once again, Bryce presented as calm, alert, and coherent. He told the officers he was okay. The officers relayed this information back to his parents. This moment is one of the most painful in the entire case, because from the parents' perspective, they had done everything right. They noticed unusual behavior. They communicated openly. They contacted authorities. They accepted professional reassurance. And still, it wasn't enough. After the welfare check, Bryce continued driving, but his parents remained on the phone with him intermittently. During these calls, his tone never shifted dramatically. He did not cry. He did not sound confused. He did not express hopelessness. If anything, he sounded distant, but controlled. This detail has led investigators and psychologists to speculate that Bryce may have been experiencing internal distress he could not articulate. But speculation is all it remains, because Bryce never verbalized it. In one call, his parents asked directly if he wanted them to come get him. Bryce said no. That answer has haunted them ever since, because it closed the last obvious door for intervention. Parents are trained, emotionally and socially, to respect their adult child's autonomy. Bryce was 19. He sounded rational. He declined help clearly. There was no legal or moral justification to force the issue. Still, something was off. As the night progressed, Bryce's calls grew shorter, not abrupt but less detailed. His responses became simpler, still calm, still polite, still distant. The last conversations did not include plans or next steps. Bryce didn't say where he was going next. He didn't give a clear destination. He didn't say goodbye. That absence is critical. In many disappearances, families later realized that the final call contained subtle closure, a phrase, a pause, a tone shift. Bryce's final calls contained none of that. They ended as if there would be another one. And then there wasn't. After Bryce drove away from Castaic Lake, communication stopped. No final message, no final call, no signal of distress. Just silence. When his parents tried to reach him again, there was no answer. That silence was louder than anything Bryce had said. Looking back, the phone calls represent both connection and helplessness. They show that Bryce was not cut off from the world, but that being connected does not always mean being reachable. You can hear someone's voice, you can believe their words, and still lose them. The calls did not fail because of neglect or indifference. They failed because Bryce's internal experience did not match his external presentation, and no one, parents, police, or professionals, recognized the disconnect in time. That is what makes this part of the story so devastating. Bryce was not alone, but he was unreachable in the one way that mattered most. In the early hours of August 28, 2013, Bryce Laspisa reached a point where movement finally replaced waiting, but instead of clarity, it brought catastrophe. Sometime after leaving the area near Castaic Lake, Bryce drove his Toyota Highlander onto a remote, winding road bordered by steep terrain. The area was sparsely populated, poorly lit, and unforgiving, especially at night. What happened next was not an accident in the conventional sense. Investigators later determined that Bryce's vehicle was intentionally driven off the road, plunging approximately 25 feet down an embankment. The car did not clip the edge. It did not skid unexpectedly. There were no signs of evasive maneuvering. The evidence suggested commitment. The Highlander traveled straight over the edge. When first responders located the vehicle later that morning, the damage was severe but survivable. The front end was crushed, the windshield shattered, airbags had deployed, but the cabin remained largely intact. There was no fire, no explosion, no catastrophic intrusion. Anyone inside the vehicle would likely have survived the impact. And that's exactly what makes the crash so disturbing. Because Bryce did survive it. Blood found inside the car indicated injury, but not fatal trauma. Investigators concluded that Bryce was alive after the crash and capable of movement. Then they found something else. Bryce's personal belongings were still inside the vehicle. His phone, his wallet, his laptop. These were not scattered. They were left behind deliberately, or at least not taken. That detail changes everything. If Bryce had been fleeing danger, he would have taken his phone. If he had been disoriented, he might have left items, but not all of them. If he had planned to disappear, leaving tools of identification behind would make sense, but not in isolation. The crash site showed no evidence of another vehicle, no skid marks suggesting pursuit, no signs of struggle or forced removal. Whatever happened after the crash happened alone. And yet, Bryce did not seek help. Nearby roads were accessible. Cell service existed in the area. Emergency responders arrived within hours, but Bryce was already gone. Searchers scoured the area surrounding the crash site. They followed paths down the embankment into brush, along dirt roads. They brought in dogs. They used helicopters. They searched ravines and culverts. Nothing. No trail leading away, no discarded clothing, no signs of prolonged movement. It was as if Bryce had vanished into the terrain. The crash itself raised immediate questions. Why drive off the road at that location? Why not brake? Why not call for help afterward? Some investigators believe the crash was a suicide attempt that Bryce unexpectedly survived. Others argue it was a deliberate but non-lethal act. An attempt to escape, to stop the car, to force an end to the night without ending his life. But no explanation fully fits. If the crash was meant to be fatal, Bryce chose a method with a low likelihood of immediate death. If it was meant to stop the car, there were safer ways to do so. If it was impulsive, it followed hours of calm, controlled behavior. Nothing aligns cleanly. Even more unsettling is what didn't happen. Bryce didn't call his parents after the crash. He didn't call 911. He didn't flag down help. He disappeared in the narrow window between survival and rescue. That window is the heart of the mystery. Search teams later noted that the terrain around the crash site was difficult but not impassable. A person on foot could reach nearby roads within a reasonable amount of time. There were no deep forests swallowing sound, no cliffs that would conceal movement completely. And yet, Bryce left no trace. The crash should have been the final chapter. In most cases, an abandoned vehicle answers questions. It explains the end of movement. It defines a search perimeter. It gives investigators something concrete. In Bryce's case, it did the opposite. It erased certainty. Because after surviving a violent crash, Bryce made a choice. He exited the vehicle. He left his belongings. He went somewhere. Where and why remain unanswered. The crash wasn't the end. It was the last physical proof that Bryce Laspisa existed in a place the world could locate. Everything after that happened beyond visibility. And that is why this moment matters more than any other, because Bryce didn't vanish into thin air. He vanished after surviving something that should have stopped him. When search teams reached the crash site near Castaic Lake, they expected one of two outcomes. Either they would find a body, or they would find evidence of injury so severe that survival was impossible. They found neither. What they found instead was proof that Bryce Laspisa had done something that should not have been possible under the circumstances. He walked away. Investigators determined that Bryce exited the vehicle under his own power. Blood inside the car suggested he had been injured, but not incapacitated. There were no signs that he had crawled, no drag marks, no indication that someone else had helped him. He stood up, and then he left. This single fact reshaped the entire case. Because once Bryce walked away from the crash, the disappearance stopped being about an accident and became about a decision. The terrain around the crash site was challenging but not lethal. It consisted of dirt paths, scrub brush, uneven ground, and steep slopes, but nothing that would immediately overwhelm a conscious adult. Nearby roads were reachable. Residential areas were not impossibly far. If Bryce had wanted help, he could have found it. That assumption haunts investigators. Search teams canvassed the area extensively. They brought in cadaver dogs, trained to detect both living and deceased humans. Helicopters flew overhead. Ground teams walked the perimeter in expanding circles. They found no trail, no footprints leading away from the crash, no blood drops extending into the brush, no discarded clothing or personal effects. Bryce's movement vanished abruptly, as if he had stepped off the map. This absence of evidence is not neutral. In search operations, something is almost always found. A shoe, a phone, a torn piece of fabric. Even in rugged terrain, movement leaves signs. Bryce left none, which raises an uncomfortable question. How does someone walk away from a crash in the dark, injured, and leave no trace at all? One explanation is that Bryce intentionally avoided detection, that he chose a route designed to minimize visibility, that he moved with purpose. But that theory conflicts with his earlier behavior: hours of waiting, repeated reassurance, no expressed intent to disappear. Another explanation is that Bryce became disoriented after the crash. Head injuries can impair judgment without rendering someone unconscious. Confusion, dissociation, and altered perception are all possible. But even in those cases, movement still leaves clues. Bryce's disappearance did not. The search radius expanded. Teams looked further from the crash site, into ravines, culverts, and dense vegetation. They followed water paths, knowing that injured individuals sometimes move downhill or towards sound. Still, nothing. This led investigators to consider a third possibility: that Bryce was picked up, not forcibly, not by strangers, but intentionally. Someone could have seen him walking, someone could have offered help, someone could have given him a ride, but there is no evidence of that either. No witnesses reported seeing a young man covered in blood or injured near the area. No tips led to confirmed sightings. No security footage captured his movement beyond the crash site, which leaves a final, deeply unsettling possibility. That Bryce didn't wander aimlessly, that he chose to leave everything behind, his phone, his wallet, his identification. In modern life, those items are extensions of identity. Leaving them behind is not accidental. It is symbolic. It suggests separation, not panic, not confusion, but intent. And yet this interpretation remains incomplete, because intent without explanation is not understanding. Bryce had multiple opportunities to explain what he was doing, to his parents, to police, to anyone. He did not. He remained calm, articulate, and present until the moment he wasn't. This creates a paradox that defines the case. Bryce did not vanish because he was unreachable. He vanished despite being reachable. The act of walking away becomes the most critical decision of his final known hours. Everything before it was communication. Everything after it was silence. And the transition between the two happened without witnesses. Investigators later acknowledged that the lack of evidence made the case extraordinarily difficult. With no body, no confirmed direction of travel, and no reliable sightings, the search eventually slowed. Years passed. No remains were found. No belongings surfaced. No credible leads emerged. The place where Bryce walked away remains frozen in time, the last point where the world can prove he existed. And the question remains unresolved. Why did Bryce walk away? Was he seeking isolation? Was he attempting to reset his life? Was he reacting to internal pressure he couldn't name? Or did something happen after the crash that no one ever saw? Every theory begins with that single step away from the vehicle, because once Bryce left the car, he left certainty behind. And whatever he was walking toward, or away from, has never revealed itself. Once it was confirmed that Bryce Laspisa had survived the crash and walked away from his vehicle, the situation escalated from concern to crisis. Search and rescue operations began almost immediately. Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department coordinated the initial response, treating the area around Castaic Lake as a high-priority search zone. Given the circumstances, an abandoned vehicle, evidence of injury, and a missing person, the assumption was that Bryce was nearby. At first, the initial search radius focused on the terrain surrounding the crash site. Deputies, volunteers, and trained search teams moved through brush, ravines, dirt roads, and hillsides on foot. They looked for footprints, blood trails, broken vegetation, any sign of movement. They found nothing. Within days, the search expanded. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras scanned the area from above, particularly at night, when body heat is easier to detect. Canine units were brought in, both tracking dogs and cadaver dogs, capable of detecting human scent over large distances. Still nothing. This absence of evidence quickly became one of the most troubling aspects of the case. In most missing person searches, terrain tells a story. Even if a person is disoriented or injured, movement leaves traces. Clothing snags, footprints appear in soft soil. Animals disturbed ground. Bryce left no such narrative behind. Investigators searched waterways and drainage areas, aware that injured individuals sometimes gravitate toward downhill paths or water sources. Dive teams checked nearby bodies of water. Nothing surfaced. As days turned into weeks, hope shifted into uncertainty. Law enforcement conducted interviews with anyone who might have seen Bryce in the hours before or after the crash. Gas station attendants, highway patrol officers, local residents. No confirmed sightings emerged. The highway patrol officers, who had interacted with Bryce earlier, were re-interviewed. Both maintained that Bryce appeared alert, coherent, and not in immediate danger. Their reports matched body camera footage and dispatch logs. There was no indication that Bryce had been detained, threatened, or mishandled. This eliminated one potential avenue and reinforced the mystery. Investigators also examined Bryce's phone records, bank activity, and digital footprint. His phone last pinged near the crash site. After that, it went silent. No texts, no calls, no data usage. His bank accounts showed no activity. His credit cards were never used again. His social security number produced no records. In modern society, this level of disappearance is rare. The investigation began to explore alternative theories. Could Bryce have planned this? Law enforcement examined his internet history, academic records, and personal relationships for signs of preparation or intent. They found none. No research into survival techniques, no messages indicating a desire to disappear, no evidence of long-term planning. Could he have suffered a medical emergency after walking away? Search teams returned to the area multiple times, years apart, as new methods became available. Each time, the outcome was the same. Nothing. No remains. No clothing. No personal effects. At one point, investigators considered whether Bryce might have been struck by a vehicle after leaving the crash site and removed from the area. This theory was investigated and found unsupported. No reports matched the timeline. No damaged vehicles were identified. Another possibility, that Bryce encountered foul play, was also explored. But without witnesses, evidence, or a body, it remained speculative. The case slowly transitioned from an active search to a long-term investigation. Bryce's parents remained deeply involved. They pushed for continued searches, public awareness, and media coverage. Missing person organizations circulated his photo nationwide. Age progression images were created and distributed. Years passed. No credible sightings were confirmed. No anonymous tips led anywhere. No physical evidence emerged. The lack of answers placed Bryce's case in a difficult category: unsolved but not cold, open but stalled. Law enforcement officials later acknowledged that the investigation had reached a point where new information was unlikely without external input. Someone would have to come forward. Something would have to be found. Until then, the case remained suspended. The search for Bryce Laspisa did not fail because of inaction or negligence. It failed because the circumstances defied normal patterns. There was no trail to follow, no mistake to correct. No overlooked clue waiting to be discovered. There was only absence. And absence is the hardest thing to investigate, because you cannot interrogate silence. You cannot reconstruct what left no mark. You cannot solve what refuses to leave evidence behind. Bryce Laspisa vanished in a way that modern systems are not designed to handle. And years later, the question remains unchanged. How does someone survive a crash, walk away, and leave nothing behind? When a person disappears without leaving physical evidence, the investigation eventually shifts from searching the ground to searching memory. That is what happened in the case of Bryce Laspisa. With no remains, no trail, and no confirmed direction of travel, investigators and the public began paying close attention to reported sightings. Moments where Bryce might have been seen alive after the crash. Most of these reports were vague. Some were well-intentioned, many were mistaken, none were confirmed. In the weeks following Bryce's disappearance, law enforcement received several tips, claiming sightings in nearby towns and along major highways. Individuals reported seeing a young man matching Bryce's description: tall, slim, red-haired, walking alone, hitchhiking, or sitting near roadways. Each lead was investigated. Each one collapsed under scrutiny. Descriptions were inconsistent. Timelines didn't align. Locations were implausible given the distance from the crash site. As time passed, sightings expanded geographically. Tips came in from neighboring states, later from across the country. Bryce's image circulated widely through missing persons networks, social media, and national databases. This created a paradox. The more visible Bryce became, the harder it was to separate genuine sightings from projection. Red hair is distinctive, but not unique. Young men traveling alone are common. Memory is unreliable, especially when primed by publicity. Law enforcement became increasingly cautious about citing reports. Without corroboration, video, transactions, digital footprints, none could be validated. And yet, the sightings never fully stopped. Years later, occasional tips would still arrive. A person who thought they recognized Bryce at a bus station. Someone who believed they had spoken to him in passing. A man who resembled Bryce working a transient job. Each time the same result. No match, no confirmation, no evidence. This absence fed speculation. Some believe Bryce chose to start over, to walk away from his life intentionally, that he shed his identity, avoided institutions, and lived off the grid. But that theory raises difficult questions. Why leave behind money, identification, and communication tools? How would he survive long-term without resources? Why maintain absolute silence for years, especially knowing his parents were searching? Others believe Bryce died shortly after walking away, succumbing to injury, exposure, or disorientation, and that his remains simply haven't been found. This explanation is statistically plausible, but it also leaves gaps. The terrain around Castaic Lake has been searched repeatedly. Conditions have changed, fires, erosion, development, yet nothing connected to Bryce has surfaced. No bones, no clothing, no personal items. Then there is the most unsettling category of questions, those without answers at all. Why did Bryce wait for hours before moving? Why did he reverse direction multiple times? Why did he insist he was fine while behaving in ways that suggested internal conflict? And perhaps the most troubling question, why did Bryce walk away without his phone? In modern life, a phone is more than a tool. It is a lifeline. People keep it even when injured, lost, or afraid. Leaving it behind suggests separation, not panic. Some interpret this as symbolic, a deliberate severing of connection. Others argue it points to cognitive impairment, an injured or altered mental state that disrupted normal judgment. But again, there is no proof. Bryce never articulated what he was experiencing. He never explained his choices, and the people who spoke to him, parents, police, did not observe signs severe enough to intervene forcibly. This creates a unique investigative dead end. There is no clear crime, no confirmed death, no evidence of survival. The case exists in a narrow space between possibilities. Even law enforcement has acknowledged this uncertainty. Bryce Laspisa's disappearance does not fit neatly into established categories. It is not a clear suicide case. It is not a clear runaway case. It is not a confirmed accident. It is unresolved because it resists classification. For Bryce's family, this ambiguity is the hardest part. Without confirmation, grief has no direction. Hope cannot fully exist, but it cannot die either. Every unconfirmed sighting reopens the wound. Every year without answers stretches the uncertainty further. Bryce's parents have stated publicly that they do not believe their son would willingly abandon them forever. They continue to seek information, not closure, because closure requires certainty. And certainty has never arrived. The unanswered questions remain stacked one on top of another, unresolved not because of neglect, but because the case offers nothing solid to resolve. Bryce Laspisa did not leave behind a mystery filled with clues. He left behind a mystery defined by absence, and in true crime, absence is the most difficult thing to explain. As the search for Bryce Laspisa failed to produce physical evidence, investigators were forced to do what every unresolved case eventually requires: move from facts to theories. None of these theories are conclusions. None have been proven. Each exists because the evidence allows it and because nothing else fully explains what happened. Theory 1. Suicide. This is the theory most often mentioned and most often misunderstood. Investigators have acknowledged that Bryce's actions could be consistent with suicidal ideation, the prolonged waiting, the intentional crash, the abandonment of personal belongings. These behaviors can, in some cases, indicate a person preparing for self-harm. But there are critical problems with this explanation. Bryce did not express suicidal thoughts to anyone. He did not say goodbye. He did not withdraw emotionally from his parents. He did not choose a method that reliably ensured death. Driving off an embankment of that height is not a guaranteed fatal act, and surviving it, as Bryce did, would typically trigger panic or a call for help if death were the goal and it failed. Instead, Bryce walked away. That behavior complicates the suicide theory significantly. If Bryce intended to die, why survive the crash and then disappear without further attempt? And why leave behind no physical evidence of death despite years of searching? Because of these contradictions, law enforcement has never ruled Bryce's disappearance a confirmed suicide. Theory 2. Accidental death after the crash. Another official consideration is that Bryce died accidentally after leaving the vehicle due to injuries, disorientation, dehydration, or environmental exposure. This theory relies on a simple premise. Survival after the crash does not guarantee long-term survival. Head injuries can impair judgment. Internal injuries may not be immediately fatal. A person may walk away only to collapse later. This explanation is plausible, but again, evidence does not support it conclusively. The area around the crash site has been searched multiple times over many years. Remains in similar environments are often found eventually, sometimes years later. In Bryce's case, nothing has surfaced. No bones, no clothing, no belongings. For accidental death to be the answer, Bryce would have had to move far enough and in a direction that evaded every search effort. That possibility exists, but it remains unproven. Theory 3. Mental health crisis without prior diagnosis. This theory has gained traction among psychologists and investigators. It suggests that Bryce may have been experiencing an acute mental health crisis, such as dissociation, severe anxiety, or a break from reality that had not previously been diagnosed. Such episodes can occur suddenly, even in individuals with no prior history. They can lead to impulsive behavior, altered perception, and decisions that appear calm on the surface, but are internally chaotic. This theory helps explain several elements: the hours of waiting, the calm reassurance, despite irrational behavior, the intentional but illogical crash, the decision to walk away without essentials. However, it does not explain everything. Even in cases of mental health crises, individuals often leave behind some trace. They are seen, they are found, they intersect with systems, hospitals, shelters, police. Bryce did not. Theory 4. Voluntary disappearance. Some believe Bryce chose to disappear intentionally. This theory suggests he walked away to start a new life, possibly aided by someone else, living under a new identity. Law enforcement has never endorsed this theory, but they have not ruled it out entirely. The challenges are obvious. Bryce left behind money, identification, and communication tools. He had no known plans, contacts, or resources to support long-term disappearance. And maintaining complete silence for years, without a single confirmed sighting or digital footprint, is extraordinarily difficult. Voluntary disappearance is rare. Voluntary disappearance without preparation is rarer still. Theory 5. Foul play. This is the least supported theory and the least discussed officially. There is no evidence Bryce encountered another person after the crash. No signs of struggle, no witness reports, no forensic indicators of violence. law enforcement has stated that there is no proof of abduction or homicide. While foul play cannot be entirely excluded, it remains speculative and unsupported by evidence. Why no theory works completely? What defines Bryce Laspisa's case is not mystery, it is imbalance. Each theory explains part of the behavior. None explain all of it. The calm phone calls contradict panic-driven explanations. The crash contradicts accidental wandering. The absence of evidence contradicts death. The lack of preparation contradicts disappearance. Officially, Bryce's case remains classified as missing, not presumed dead, not ruled suicide, not closed, because the evidence does not justify certainty. Investigators have acknowledged that without new information, a discovery, a credible witness, or physical remains, the case cannot progress beyond theory, and so it remains suspended. A young man who should not have vanished. A series of decisions that should have led to intervention. A disappearance that resists explanation not because it is complex, but because it is incomplete. More than a decade after his disappearance, Bryce Laspisa remains exactly where he was left on August 28, 2013. Missing. The case has never been closed, it has never been solved, and it has never moved beyond uncertainty. Today, Bryce's disappearance is officially classified as an open missing person case. Law enforcement has not declared him deceased. There is no death certificate, no legal resolution, no final determination. That status matters, because it reflects what this case truly is, not a mystery with an answer waiting to be discovered, but a story suspended in time. In the years since Bryce vanished, investigators have received occasional tips, most of them vague and unverified. None have produced physical evidence. None have resulted in confirmed sightings. None have advanced the case meaningfully. Search efforts have slowed, not because of neglect, but because of limitation. Without new information, there is nowhere else to search. The terrain has been revisited. The evidence has been re-examined. The digital footprint has been exhausted. Everything that can be reviewed has been reviewed. What remains is absence. Bryce's parents, Mike and Karen Laspisa, continue to live with that absence every day. They have spoken publicly about the unique pain of not knowing, about how uncertainty prevents closure, how hope and grief coexist in constant tension. They have stated repeatedly that they do not believe Bryce would willingly disappear forever. They describe him as a young man who maintained strong family ties, who communicated openly, and who did not sever relationships. And yet, they acknowledge the reality. Years have passed without contact. That contradiction defines their experience and the case itself. Over time, Bryce's story has become part of a larger conversation about missing adults, mental health, and the limits of intervention. His disappearance highlights a critical truth that law enforcement and families alike struggle with. You cannot force help on someone who appears rational, coherent, and autonomous. Bryce spoke clearly. He declined assistance. He passed welfare checks. Every system designed to intervene did what it was allowed to do, and still it wasn't enough. This is why Bryce's case continues to resonate far beyond the details of what happened near Castaic Lake. It challenges assumptions about warning signs. It complicates the idea that disappearance requires chaos, secrecy, or dramatic rupture. Sometimes people vanish quietly. Sometimes they do everything right until the moment they don't. Today, Bryce's name remains in national missing persons databases. Age-progressed images continue to circulate. His case is still eligible for review if new evidence emerges. But realistically, investigators acknowledge that resolution is unlikely without a discovery, a body, a confirmed sighting, a witness willing to speak. Until then, the case exists in a liminal space, neither active nor closed, neither solved nor forgotten. It simply remains. What does Bryce Laspisa's disappearance teach us? It teaches us that communication does not equal understanding, that calm does not guarantee safety, that proximity does not ensure control. It reminds us that mental distress does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides behind politeness, reassurance, and delay, and it forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Modern systems are built to respond to crisis, but not ambiguity. Bryce did not fit the profile of someone in immediate danger. He did not meet the threshold for intervention. He did not break the rules that trigger emergency response. And so he slipped through, not because no one cared, not because no one acted, but because uncertainty is invisible. Where the case stands today is exactly where it stopped in 2013, at a crashed vehicle, at an empty landscape, at a young man who walked away and was never seen again. There is no dramatic conclusion, no final revelation, no resolution waiting in the shadows, only questions, and the knowledge that somewhere, whether alive or not, Bryce Laspisa's story ended without witnesses. That is why this case still matters, because it is not just about what happened to Bryce. It is about how easily certainty can disappear, one quiet decision at a time.